Okay, we're ready.
Okay, this is the hearing of the Ventura County Air Pollution Control District Hearing Board on October 15th, 2007. It's 25 minutes before 6 o'clock. Members present are Robert Shackman, Stephen Herlock, and Kate Neiswender. Could we have the oath, please, to the people who are going to testify?
Please stand and raise your right hands. You and each of you, do you solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give and the matters now pending before this board are the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you.
And we are going to hear petition number 797, petition of Vintage Production California LLC for a regular variance from District Rule 29C, conditions on permits, violation of permit to operate number 00310, condition 9.b, and Rule 74.15, boilers, steam generators, and process heaters, Section B1, requirements. And we will begin with hearing from the petitioner. Would you please identify yourselves and then go ahead with your presentation?
Good evening. My name is Angela Huber. I'm the HES representative tonight.
And my name is David Stoneberger. I'm the production coordinator. I oversee the operation of the piece of equipment that we're discussing tonight.
Ms. Hubert, to repeat your job or your function, I didn't understand it.
I'm the health, environment, and safety representative tonight.
Floor is yours.
We are petitioning for a variance to continue to run a Latoka heater. This unit was found to be in violation on June 26th. We did receive at that time an interim variance. In the meantime, we have followed all of the board's recommendations to monitor the unit. We have proceeded with setting up the new heater. We need to, if possible, run this heater until we get the new one online. On August 9th, we installed 2 CO2 detection monitors, one outside, one inside the office. They are set to alarm at the OSHA CO limit. No alarms have been recorded. On October 3rd, we submitted to the district a progress report. We have poured the foundation. We have the new heater on the pad. We are installing the pipes and hope to have that commissioned and up and running by November 2nd, at which time we would then dismantle and remove the Latoka heater. Any questions?
Do board members have questions?
I have quite a few questions that I can begin. Okay. This one, bear with me because we have an original draft order and a revision. My notes are in the original. Have you read the draft order? I assume that you.
Yes.
If the board grants the variance based on this order without any changes, would you have any problems with it?
No, sir. I believe we can meet all the conditions required.
Thank you. Just for clarification, on page 2 under background, it talks about 10 facilities and where they're located. Excuse me. Maybe I already. Maybe you can help me. Do the locations count up to 8. I was wondering if there may be more than one facility at some of the locations here, and if so, we could just add that. If I count 8 facilities located in Ventura County, I count 1 Ojai, 1 says 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Are there multiple facilities at those locations, or are there other locations?
Good question. It could. I'm counting these up, and one that I noticed is missing is the what we call the grub lease, which is a different permit, and none of that production flows to this processing plant. So that might be the omission.
Mr. Herlock, I think I might be able to explain the discrepancy in the numbers. I think there are 1 or 2 leases that are referenced here, or permitted leases where there's actually more than one facility, but because they're contiguous leases, Vintage considers them separate leases, but for permitting purposes, they have one permit. So I think that's
probably a better description, looking at the list that's here.
Good. I guess I'd like to ask if the district could clarify this so that the numbers in the text correspond to the locations.
Sure.
Just
We can do that.
Just so that the count is right. This next question really isn't an issue with respect to your permit or the emissions, but we've had a number of cases over the past probably 3 years where there was too much CO2 in the gas, and the petitioner couldn't sell it to the gas company because of that, and they didn't have a good way to remove it. That doesn't come up in your, is that an issue for Vintage? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Not relative to this variance, but we do have a CO2 removal facility that removes CO2 from some of the gas that's processed at this plant.
Thank you. I guess we have an update on the source test. And the previous report that we got didn't include ROC or PM. It just talked about CO, which was kind of the subject of the previous interim variance hearing. So that source test has been, if you can't answer this, maybe I can ask the district. Was this strictly speaking a source test? When I hear source test, I think of a test that's required by the permit on an annual or so basis, and the district is invited to witness, and then it's fully reported. And I don't think that's why you did this test. Is that? And you weren't. The test that's reported here isn't. I don't think is that kind of a test. Perhaps if you're puzzled by this, maybe Mr. Duval could step in.
I'll try and help you out here.
Okay.
Initially, Vintage conducted what we call an engineering or screening test that found the high levels of carbon monoxide emissions coming from the heater. That was not an official test. It was just, I think, using more of a handheld portable device. On June 22nd, they did conduct an official source test. The district was invited to attend or observe that test. We weren't able to get out and observe that test, but they did send an official source test report to us. This heater or natural gas-fired heaters under Rule 7415 are required to be tested once every 2 years. So this heater's biennial source test.
So that source test was to meet the requirements of the permit, even though everybody knew that it wasn't going to meet the
That's correct.
technical requirements.
That's correct.
That's what I was confused about.
And Rule 74.15 only has oxides of nitrogen and carbon monoxide emission limits that they have to meet. So we only required them to test for carbon monoxide and oxides of nitrogen.
So the ROCs that got reported in the additional material tonight is not part of the official source test. It's just numbers that you You have?
That's correct, yes.
As long as we're talking about this, I have another issue. Is the excess fees calculations, does their permit limit the ROCs that can be emitted by this facility?
Only to the extent that there are permitted emissions based on emission factors from EPA. We use those factors to generate the permitted emissions, which are primarily for billing purposes when we bill for their annual permit renewals.
Their excess emission fees for this variance period are based on CO.
That's
as
correct.
I understand it.
That's correct.
Even though they're emitting a lot more ROC, I would guess, than what they're permitted.
Yes, lacking any hard evidence or hard numbers on the reactive organic compounds or particulate matters, we don't have any data to fall back on to calculate excess emissions for those two pollutants. So the excess emission fees would be based just on carbon monoxide.
But their permit does have a limit for ROC.
On a pounds per hour and tons per year basis, yes.
And one would assume that they're exceeding that. I would assume they're exceeding that with this boiler that's probably, not oxidizing all the carbon. The nitrogen oxides are low. That when a boiler runs like that, I would expect that the ROC emissions would be very high. Maybe not as high as the CO emissions, but high.
Yeah, I think you would expect the ROC and probably also the particulate emissions to be elevated from what we calculate using the emission factors.
And is there, under the rules, would that excess ROC emission not carry an excess emission fee?
If we had values for those excess emissions showing that they were actually over the permitted emissions, then we would charge them for those excess fees. Charge them fees for those excess emissions.
But is there anybody who thinks that they're not over the permitted emissions? Yeah.
Well, this is just something that I started thinking about when I got your email this morning, and haven't really been able to do any investigation on it.
I'm sorry, may I offer a comment?
Yes, please do.
If it would please the board to have some data to assess what those excess emissions might be, we can try to schedule, and I don't know if we could successfully get on the contractor's schedule, but if we could offer to perform another source test and capture actual data on those emissions before we shut it down.
I thought I saw somewhere in the material we got tonight an ROC emission. Did I?
Page 5 of the revised draft.
Well, this is the ROC
From the flare.
from the flare. I'm talking about ROCs from the boiler.
Looks like on page 6 there, there's one if I'm reading it correctly.
What brought my attention to this is that there's no estimate for excess ROC emissions in that table on page 6. And my comment in my email is that if essentially forgiving the excess ROC emissions or forgiving excess PM emissions would result in a lower excess emission fees, I would have a hard time with that. Because I think that probably would, certainly the district has the tools to estimate ROC emissions, and if they use them, I'm guessing, educated guess, that the ROC emissions would be outside over and above the permit. But I see that we don't have any data. Mr. Stormburner has offered to get that data. That's helpful. My issue is whether that data should be the basis of additional excess emission fees, which I don't see why it shouldn't be.
So that could be in a motion down the road.
Okay. It seems as though the basis for calculating those fees would be an estimate, unless Vintage provides the data, then the data would be the basis. Okay. I guess that takes care of that subject. In the draft order, you have some milestones. I didn't notice if they changed, and you also provided Chris Cody with the schedule. Can you tell us how that's going? That some of the dates are already passed and are either this week, I think.
Yeah, by and large, looking at page 3 of the draft order, that the schedule that's been there is pretty much the way it has occurred. We currently have the new heater on site. It's set on the new pad. It's bolted down. We have welders as of today welding pipeline runs and fittings together to bolt the heater to the process.
So you did accomplish setting the heater in place, and you're doing the piping. So
Yes,
you're,
sir.
based on that, you think you're on schedule. And
I don't foresee any hiccups to starting up by November 2nd. That's still our goal.
thank you. Got some questions. As I think you know, this board needs to make some findings of fact. And during the interim hearing, I'm not looking at finding number 2 now, which is often the difficult one for us, that says due to conditions beyond the reasonable control of the petitioner. And that's always the question, the reasonable control. And during the interim variance hearing, we made that finding. I think I asked a little bit about maintenance and inspections, and you know, arguably one could take a harder line than that and say that you should have known about this if your maintenance and inspection had been such that you inspected or that, did something a little more rigorous. And what I'm looking for here is if you can tell us what you might do with the new equipment to prevent getting surprised. I mean, this says that you were surprised, and you were. But my question is, I can probably make that finding with a fairly lenient reading, but I'd like to know what you're doing, what you can do in the way of I'm thinking of inspections or maybe possibly maintenance to prevent being surprised if 5-10 years down the line, if the same kind of thing or some other unknown thing happens.
Yeah, the failure mechanism basically was internal to the old heater. Best thing I intend to do is, because the way the new heater is fabricated, it'll be much easier to perform periodic inspections. We have 6 to 12 month intervals that we shut the plant down anyway for maintenance. At that time, with the new heater configuration, it'll be relatively easy to open up the firebox and look at the flue gas path and make sure that there aren't any obstacles or fallen material inside that would cause the same problem again.
Will that procedure be part of your plant operation?
It'll be part of our computerized maintenance management program. It will automatically call up and remind us that we need to do it when whatever that frequency is. I'm guessing it will be 6 to 12 month intervals. Okay.
If I may, I'd like to switch to the board. I have a related question. Mr. Duval, when a operation like this gets permitted, do the procedures, does the district look at the procedures and also include them in the what I'll call the inspection or the process by which they decide to permit the facility, or is it just a hardware kind of?
It's we just really look at the hardware, the emission controls that are going to be installed, the low NOx burner. We do have, as I mentioned earlier, boilers and heaters like this are required to do a source test biennially. And I really think this was just kind of a quirk, you might say, in happening. I can't remember a similar instance of something similar in the past.
So, do you have any fault with Vintage's inspection procedure prior to this incident that you know of?
No. I think if there were indications of, excessive fuel consumption, visible emissions, rumbling or from the unit that was not common to the unit, then I would have some issues with that. But from what I understand, that wasn't the case in this unit.
Okay. Finally, one question. Finding number 5 that this board needs to make has to do with the applicant. It says during the period of the variances, in fact, the applicant will reduce excess emissions to the maximum extent feasible. And I'd made a comment to Mr. Duvall about it looked like the text there was really kind of a cut and paste, and it's been changed in the revised draft that we got this evening. But in spite of that, what this says is that you're going to do what you would like to do anyway, which is to run the heater and rather than flare, because it just so happens that running the heater rather than flaring produces less emission. That's not, I guess what I'd like to look for under this finding number 5 is that there's some proactive thing, something that you are doing to reduce emissions. This is just something that you're doing what you would like to do anyway, and it happens to produce less emissions. But is there some way during the next 4 months that you could reduce emissions?
Trying to think outside the box here, because the only other alternative we've considered is shutting down production, and in essence we would have to shut down all of our production in order to shut this heater off.
Is production an on-off thing, or can you throttle it back? Or does that not influence the? I guess what you would need to throttle back would be the boiler. Not necessarily.
The furnace would have to be throttled back. The furnace has 2 primary heat sinks. One is for the processing of liquids, and one is for regenerating our dehydration system. And the dehydration system's load would be in essence the same, and the fractionator could be reduced somewhat, but it would be. I'm just kind of speaking arbitrarily here, but somewhat insignificant. There would still be a certain amount of liquids produced. There would be less. It would reduce the load on the heater. I don't believe that it would be significant.
I didn't quite understand. So would that be a throttling back of production?
I'm sorry, yeah. If we throttled back production, we started shutting wells off in the field.
But is there a way to throttle production without shutting any wells?
No, sir.
There's not.
No, sir.
So there's no way to throttle a well to produce less oil and less gas?
No. All these wells are on secondary recovery, which means the primary formation and the primary recovery mechanism is a thing of the past, where formation pressure no longer drives the production to the wells.
Okay. Thank you. Dr. Shackman, I'm assuming that you're going to say something about the CO.
I am.
Okay, then
But feel free.
No, go ahead.
Okay,
That's all I
I'll
have for the moment.
I'll ask Ms. Neiswender if she has questions.
Only one question. You say that you had alarmed the plants that it would trigger at OSHA limits? Yes, ma'am. What is the OSHA limit?
30 parts per million.
Thank you. That's all I have.
Well, let's look at page 7, number 8. It says continued operation is not likely to create an immediate threat or hazard to public health or safety. We had concern about that at the previous hearing, and as a result, you undertook a monitoring program. Could you describe your monitoring program?
We have 2 portable devices that log data on periodic intervals. We set one of those devices inside the building to protect employees, and we set one unit outside, downwind of the heater location to just gather data. There's typically not people working in that area. For personnel that are required to work in the immediate vicinity of the area, we've rented some personal CO monitors that they wear on their person that would give them an alarm if they were to hit the permissible exposure limit.
And the results of that monitoring is not in the material that we have. Have you presented that data to the district?
The data from the personal monitors that employees wear near the heater is not recorded, it's not logged, it's not electronically logged, so we don't have that data to provide. The data, Mr. Duvall, did we provide copies of the downloaded reports from the portable monitors?
We received some reports. I'm not sure if it was the total of all of the reports, but there were days here and there with some gaps in it.
Yeah, and we did have some problems with those portable devices, some reliability problems.
So the one that's in the building, could you tell me about the range of readings that you got, the minimum, the maximum, the averages that you've calculated?
Sure. The one inside the building has not been observed hitting any alarm limits, and when the reports are printed, none of them show any readings at all. The reports that I looked at,
Excuse me, I'm not sure I understand.
Okay.
Are you saying that they report 0 CO?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Do you think it's working?
Yes, sir. Yeah, they're calibrated by the vendor that we rent them from.
So they had a industrial hygienist out when they installed it, and the person verified that these were functioning?
No, these are calibrated by technicians that own the equipment, and we set the equipment in its place and download the data that it logs.
Okay, so that person who should have expertise with the equipment verified, I presume, by having a test sample that the device was working.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, that's correct. Okay. What happened downwind?
Downwind, we did log some peaks. Angie, the highest peak that I recall seeing is 70 parts per million. Time-weighted average, we did not hit the permissible exposure limit at that location either.
Time-weighted average gave you what average? What did you get? Now, was that on a daily basis?
I'm sorry?
The time-weighted average, was that on a daily basis?
Yes, sir. If we find a report with some data on it, I'll give you a better answer.
On September 24th, we had a CO peak of 64 parts per million. It occurred at 2:21 p.m. The reading taken at 2:24 was 5 parts per million. So it only has short peaks. Time rated average for that day ended up being, I'm sorry, it was on an 8-hour day because that's what the employees work. Even though they aren't in that building the entire time, we went with the 8-hour average. And it ended up being less than 1. I don't have the data with me, I'm sorry.
Less than 1 part per million?
Yes, sir.
And then the personal monitors, could you tell me how they are functioning?
What do you mean by the question?
I mean by the question, you said you don't have a printout, so I'd like to know what they're doing.
Oh, the device has a cell in it that analyzes that data, and it has a visible display. If the device hits 30 parts per million, it flashes a red light and vibrates And it sounds an audible alarm for the employee to know to leave the area or move upwind.
So that'd be 30 parts per million on an instantaneous basis.
Yes, sir.
And has that happened?
It has happened. And the practice is employees move crosswind or upwind and allow the mission to pass, and then they'll re-enter the area with the monitor. If the monitor does not go back up, they'll continue their work if it does, which hasn't happened, honestly. We've pulled away, given the area a few minutes to aerate, and are able to go back to work.
How many employees are wearing personal monitors?
We have several at the site that can be used, and only if a crew of 2 or 3 are going to be working together, then the lead person on that crew will be asked to have the monitor with him. There are 10 or 12 people that might work at the site on any given day, but it's rare that we have employees working in the immediate vicinity of the heater.
Now, the downwind unit that does have some positive measurements, could you give me a sense of how it's located relative to the source of the emissions?
Let's see, we located at the C train. It's about 60 or 70 feet downwind, fairly level with the stack.
As I recall, when we had the last hearing, we didn't really have a model as to how emissions leave that stack and are distributed afterwards. Do we know anything more about that today?
A model of the plume?
Of the plume, yes.
No, I'm sorry, I don't have that.
And does the district have anything to add on that point?
The only thing that I might add is that the plume that comes out of the stack is relatively hot, so it would have some buoyancy, but it's fairly low velocity plume, so it doesn't get shot way up in the air, you might say. So there could be some downwash. A lot of it depends on the topography in the area and the wind patterns and things like buildings and trees and other structures that might create some eddies and capture the CO emissions in the area.
Well, that sounds like something that a professor dealing with this issue might have presented, but I'm wondering if you have a sense of the validity of the downwind measurement as a guide to the satisfaction of 0.8 of our requirement here.
Well, I think being downwind and being a distance of 60 or 70 feet away is probably a good indicator if there's going to be any excess CO emissions. I think that might be in an area where you might expect at least periodically to have some peak CO levels touching down.
Then you're satisfied with the siting as meeting the requirement under 0.8?
Yes, yes. The data that I recollect looking at last week that they provided, the peaks, the peak CO levels might have been for just a moment or two, or a minute or 5 minute period, and then it would go back down to 0 or very negligible amounts.
Yeah, they've talked about the 30 part per million time-weighted average, and I don't recall right now what the maximum allowable instantaneous measurement is for CO in an occupational situation. Do you know the answer to that?
I believe it's 200 parts per million.
So we have no measurements that reach that high.
Not that I'm aware of.
And I believe that the environmental standard was 9 parts per million, and they are well below that at 1 part per million.
That's correct.
Okay. Well, I guess that answers all the questions that I had on that point. Mr. Herlock, did you have more?
In the context of the monitors, I also noted that there was nothing reported. If the board added a reporting requirement for the CO monitors, would Vintage have any problem with that?
What monitor, or what reporting would
Well,
you have in mind?
the draft order talks about increments of progress and reporting requirements. And neither in the interim order nor in this order is the reporting of the CO monitors included, and I would like to consider including them.
Reporting the CO from the stationary monitors would be no problem. We can turn those in as needed. We currently do not have a reading on the personal monitors that the employees wear. They're simply in an alarm monitor. They're not recorded.
When the event or events that Mr. Stoneburner said had happened, does that get logged somewhere?
When an employee's monitor goes off?
Yes.
It would only be recorded in the case of a confined space entry or otherwise highly hazardous operation. Otherwise, it's just a monitor to tell the employee to take some action to recede. If the board would like to see those data points or those alarm times recorded, that's something we could certainly accomplish through our permitting process.
I think I would like to see the log presented with your monthly reporting and the events. I'm surprised that if an employee has a personal monitor that goes off and they take action going downwind or crosswind, that doesn't get logged somewhere. That surprises me. I think it should, and I think that should be included in your report. I don't know how Dr. Shackman feels about that.
How many times a day is it happening?
Well, it would be times per month, not times per day, because
Okay.
it's infrequent.
I think then it's a low enough volume that we're not burdening them with anything unreasonable to record that.
Can you estimate how many times it's happened to date?
I'm only aware of twice.
Only aware of twice for any of the employees wearing monitors. How many employees are there?
There are 12 company employees and a number of contractors.
And how many monitors are out there?
There are several available for working at that site as needed.
Does several mean more than 12?
No, sir. No, we've got 3 monitors that we've rented, and we make those available for crews that would be working at the site.
3 is few, not several in my
Okay.
vocabulary. And you've said that you don't send a crew out with at least one monitor per crew
Yes, sir.
into that area?
You probably maintain a log of occupational illnesses, some kind of log of events. Have there been any instances that are believed attributable to exposure to carbon monoxide in the last few months?
No, sir.
No.
Well, I don't have anything else. Does anybody else have additional questions for petitioner? Petitioner then take a break and we'll ask the district. Does anyone have questions for the district that we haven't already asked? No questions for the district? Does the district?
nothing.
Oh, yes.
I have nothing. I was just letting you know.
Okay. Does the district have any questions?
I have a question for
sorry.
the district, sorry. Mr. Duval, if we added not sure where it would be added, but if we added the idea that I was speaking of earlier to, first of all, evaluate, is my assumption that if the ROCs exceed the permit, that there would be additional excess emission fees, correct?
That's correct.
I guess I would like to then include that somehow. Maybe we can work through that. But would the district have any difficulty with implementing or that kind of a requirement? I'm thinking for the period of the variance to include Vintage's test results. If they don't don't know if, I guess we can require them to do further testing. If not, that the district make an estimate based on what is known as far as the NOx and the CO. I think that the district probably has models that could estimate on basically, excess ROC. And perhaps we can craft something that includes a calculated estimate pending vintage providing measured data, and use that as the basis for excess emissions based on ROC for the period of the variation, if it's higher than the CO based. Do you have a comment on that?
Off the top of my head, what I'm thinking is that you might want to see a requirement that would have Vintage conduct a source test for ROC and particulate matter prior to decommissioning the heater. If that's not feasible, I'm not sure where we would be able to find estimates of excess emissions when the CO, when they have combustion problems like they're having. And maybe your board might want to consider just setting some, you might say, arbitrary multiplication factor to their permitted emissions, a factor of 4 or 5.
Well, I guess I don't think the board is qualified to set that multiplication factor, but I certainly think the district is, your engineering department. And if that estimate is superseded by test data, then the test data would take precedence in calculating the excess emissions.
Yes.
Excess emission fees.
I think that the petitioner offered to perform testing for ROC. I'm not sure about particulate. Are you indeed able to do that testing?
I'd have to check with the testing vendor, but if we can get on their schedule and that test is available, we'd be willing to provide the information.
Getting on their schedule would have two factors to it: their schedule, but also your decommissioning schedule.
Yes, sir.
Do you have a sense of how those two lines will intersect?
Well, we're hoping to commission and start up the new heater by November 2nd, so that means we need to get on the phone first thing in the morning and see what we can do.
What's your experience with them as far as their responsiveness to requests for measurements?
We have 2 vendors that I'm familiar with. And each of them have been accommodating when they can, but sometimes if you just happen to hit them in a tight scheduling time, it may be difficult to get them.
I'm guessing you would be more comfortable with actual data rather than an estimate based on some formula.
That would be my preference.
And does the district feel that way too?
Yes.
I know I feel better that way.
Otherwise, it's just a shot in the dark. And unless we could come up with some firm data, and I'm not sure where we could get that data.
I think Mr. Herlock's point's well taken, that we would be remiss if we did not identify excess emissions in those 2 categories.
Yes, sir.
Have you more questions for the district?
Mr. Duvall, I'm not sure whether for the board's information, I found what appeared to be at least something I didn't understand in the material, and Mr. Duvall addressed it in his letter, and I'm not quite sure I understand. Could you possibly go through your item 6A and help me understand what you're saying here?
Sure.
On your
What page is that on?
it's the addendum that we got, and it's the second page of it. There's a 2-page letter that was handed out.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Herlock's question to me in an email today was it appeared that there was an inconsistency in the ratio of the units tested emissions, which were about 4,700 parts per million, and the Rule 47 emission limit for NOx emissions, which is 400 parts per million. That's a ratio of about 12 to 1. The permitted emissions the permitted emissions are based on a much lower value than 400 parts per million. We use, I'm sorry, this is carbon monoxide emissions, but for carbon monoxide emissions, we use a much lower emission factor that we get from the Environmental Protection Agency, and it's roughly based on about 85 parts per million of carbon monoxide. So when you compare the two ratios of permitted emissions to tested emissions, the numbers just don't work. But that's because the permitted emissions are based on a much lower number than 400 parts per million. 400 parts per million is a number that we put in our rule a long time ago as a maximum level not to be exceeded, whereas permitted emissions, roughly about 85 parts per million, is from an emission factor that's derived by the Environmental Protection Agency, and it's pretty consistent with the numbers that we've seen in source tests in this type of equipment or very similar equipment.
Is the excess emission fees then based on finding where in the revised draft order?
We really don't address what the emission fees are based on in the draft order, but the way we would calculate them would be in excess of what's permitted. So it would be the excess emission fees would be based on those numbers greater than 0.52 pounds per hour, which is based on 85 parts per million.
So if I look at page 6 under this table, permitted, I see 0.52, and under estimated, I see 21.78. That factor would be somehow the basis for the excess.
That's correct.
Okay. And okay. No further questions. Unless maybe we should, before you close the hearing, see if we can figure out a way to get some help on finding the similar factor for the ROC and the PM, whether the board wants to require a test, or whether in lieu of that, I would suggest use the same multiplier for ROC as is being used for CO, and I think that may motivate Vintage to do the test.
I defer to the district on the reasonableness of that. I don't have a personal sense of reasonableness of it.
Can you comment on that?
It would be a shot in the dark. It is that would just be an arbitrary number. One thing to consider is that the permitted ROC and particulate emission numbers are really very low. ROC is 0.03 pounds per hour and particulate is 0.07 pounds per hour. The factor that we apply for excess emissions, I believe, would be about $150 per pound per hour. And then we also calculated excess tons using the same roughly $150.
If I made a motion to include excess emission fees for ROC and particulate matter such that it was based on a recognized test at vintage, and in lieu of that, an estimate from the district, could the district work that out?
We could work that out.
Okay. No more questions.
Any other questions? Is there any public comment? I see there's no public comment. Then the hearing is closed, and does any member of the board wish to discuss the matter further or make a motion?
I'd like to discuss with the board what I've been talking about, get your feeling on whether an additional requirement to, I think I heard you say, Dr. Shackman, that you would agree that it was an oversight to not include those fees.
I agree with you, and I admire your attention to detail and identifying that and bringing it to the district's attention. I think we should rectify it. I think the language that you proposed a little bit ago that Mr. Duval agreed on would handle the matter. It could go under reporting requirements B1 on page 8.
What about the recording, the reporting on the CO monitors? How do you feel about that?
I think it's not quite as important because we've received testimony, which is sworn testimony, and was reassuring on the distance between levels that are worrisome and what they're recording on a time-weighted average. It's a little hard to interpret the individual exposures as people are moving around, and someone with a monitor could be very, very close to the source of emissions. It's good that that monitoring is being done and that people are removing themselves immediately if they do hit the alarm level. I think it's reasonable for us to ask for records on that.
Okay.
I think that's your question.
Yes.
I think it's reasonable, yes. And the records then would be of two types. We would be given whatever printout data these devices provide, so we would know about time-weighted averages and maximum measurements, and we'd also be told about individuals who are having their alarm levels hit.
Okay. Then if
Is that what you have in mind?
that's what I would have in mind, given that discussion, I move that we modify the order by including under reporting requirements that the CO monitors that provide logs be recorded on the same frequency as the other reporting, and I think that's monthly, and that the incidence of personnel monitors alarming be logged and included in the monthly report.
And that would go under B1?
That would go under, either would be a separate or go under
It would either have to either be a B1 or a separate B2, right there at the beginning.
or a B somewhere. I think it almost would be separate because B1 ends with talking about excess emission fees based on this data. Yeah.
Clarification, what are we asking for from the personal monitors? Are we asking for data on each time they go off?
I think we want a record of each time they go off.
And then there was another comment about time-weighted averages. Is that separate from that data?
Yeah, their stationary monitors provide some sort of a log, printout or something.
Okay, so that's already covered by B1 then?
I don't think it is.
No?
No.
No, it isn't.
Okay, then that,
We need to add that requirement.
then that should go back into A, I would imagine.
Well, under A, we have A4. It says continue monitoring CO emissions with personal monitors But what we're asking here for is a report on the results of that monitoring.
Yeah, I think it's under reporting because we are doing it. That's,
Well, I'm talking about the time-weighted stuff.
And they're collecting it under
Yeah.
A4, and now we're asking for reporting of it, and we're trying to determine where that requirement should fall.
Oh, okay, we do have both of those in there then. So separate B2 to talk about the time-weighted averages and the personal monitors, correct?
And then everything else would be renumbered.
Just renumber it.
yes. And then I would also want to modify the order by Mr. Oriana, do you see a problem with us requiring the petitioner to make these tests?
No, you're allowed in the health and
That's-
safety code to have reasonable additional conditions as long as it's not something I've been working in the industry. You've got a specific health concern here with your finding number 8, and I think the modifications you're suggesting are addressed to making sure there is no health hazard.
Yeah. Well, I'm now talking about the additional testing to get the excess ROCs and the excess.
Well, then I guess it would just be what's within the scope of the hearing today and the district's authority to calculate and treat excess emissions.
Well, my question is, do you see a problem with the board requiring the petitioner to measure ROC and particulate matter, just as they did CO? Mr. Stoneburner offered to do that. And I would like to include that as a requirement. And I think it would probably go under under the petitioner shall.
Health safety code standard is to not make requirements that are more onerous or inapplicable to the equipment or the industry before you. I think the more fundamental question may be whether it's related to the interim or the variance that's being requested as opposed to other actions the district needs to take in regard to excess emissions.
Well, I think it is in the sense that that there are excess emissions, and without this item being included in the order, there would not be excess emission fees to go with it.
If the district confirms that, then it seems reasonable.
I would concur with that.
Then I would.
Ms. Niswander?
Perhaps what we need to do to move this forward is to have the exact language not worked out at this time, but rather leave that in Mr. Duval's hands and have you understand, obviously, what we're trying to do here.
Yes.
So under Section A of the petitioner shall, we'll need a paragraph in there somewhere that says that they've got to monitor it. They've already agreed to do so, if possible. If they are unable to get the monitors in place in the time necessary, then pursuant to paragraph B1, the amendment that Mr. Perlock just made, then the district would make the estimates. But to try to craft this
I
on the
agree.
fly is going to be too difficult. But you understand what we're trying to do.
I understand.
And that's the amendment that you're making to the order. That would be the amended motion that you're making, or the motion for the amended order?
It would be, the motion for the amended order would include the recording of the submittal of the recording for the CO monitors, as well as the test to measure ROC and particulate matter, and submit that report. And then
Which would then go under your amendment in paragraph
it would be probably
about the emissions.
Probably B2.
it would-
Yes, B1. Actually, it's,
Well, the item 7 says submit a source test report demonstrating compliance with permit. Oh, that's for the new one. So we're asking for a report measuring the existing. And I guess it would go under item A, that the petitioner shall make a test and report.
and
the
again,
results.
I'm going to say that it's going to be really hard to
Yeah.
recraft this on the fly. But as long as Mr. Duval has been taking meticulous notes, we should be all right.
Okay.
If I can maybe boil this down to what I hear, we would write a new paragraph under Section A that would say to the effect that Vintage shall conduct an emissions test for ROC and particulate matter prior to decommissioning the heater. In the event this isn't feasible, Vintage shall, or the district shall make an estimation of the excess emissions of ROC and particulate.
Yes. That was my intent.
That's what I understand.
Okay.
And additionally, Vintage will provide data on their CO monitoring.
Correct.
Which is a reporting requirement.
And that would be under B.
I think so.
And I move that with those amendments, we grant the variance.
Is there a second?
Second.
It has been moved and seconded. May we have the roll call, please?
Ms. Neiswender?
Aye.
Mr. Hurlock?
Aye.
And Dr. Shackman?
Aye.
The variance has been granted. Thank you very much for your participation. I think it would be best if you're in contact with Mr. Duval on the timing of getting the exact document out, and as soon as it's sent to me, of course, I'm going to deal with it and send it back to Mr. Duval. So that may take a few days, but in the meantime, if you can get to work on the issue of getting the testing for ROC in particular done rather than waiting to see the final order, I think it's best for everyone.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you to the board. I'd like to pass on to our employees your stewardship of their health and safety concerns too.
Thank you. Well, we don't seem to have anything else on our agenda unless the district has something.
Nothing else on the agenda, just a brief comment. Mr. Gasparino has had to step down from the hearing board, and we have put out notice for his position as well as Dr. Shackman's position via press release, notice to the Air Pollution Control Board, and I've made contact with the County Medical Association to see if they might have somebody that they're aware of that would be willing to fill Dr. Shackman's big shoes over there.
Well, I'll serve through the end of this year, which is the end of my appointment, and hopefully there'll be someone who will take it up then.
Yeah, that's what I understand.
I have a question. This finding 8 that we talked about a little bit, we heard a meeting or two ago that there was a rules change coming along that would remove that finding. How's that going?
I'm not sure what the status of that is. I know I sent an email to Mike Viegas, our director, and the rules engineer, the need to make that change, but I haven't heard where that's at yet.
Why would you want to remove the requirement that there be no threat to public health or safety?
Well, I think what we were going to do is try and clarify it, what the intent was, and I'd have to go back and look at my note.
In the cases where we're permitting a diesel, stationary diesel generator that emits particulate, can't make that finding any longer. I don't think we can make the finding because of the...
I remember the discussion now.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Let's come back. But the finding is still important. It's a matter of reconciling that requirement with the nature of diesel engines and another determination the state has made about diesel engines.
That's correct.
Is there any other business then? Then we are adjourned at 20 minutes of 7. Oh, Mr. Duval, do we have another meeting scheduled?
No meeting scheduled. Currently, we are looking at 2 potential cases to bring to your board, but we're still working on the details.